You're hung up in something old and would actually like to break out of it, but don't know how that works. For example, you're stuck in a relationship where you can sense that it's not really fitting. Or you're stuck in a job that doesn't fit anymore. Or you sense that it's time for something new. For example, you're retiring, or the kids are out of the house, or a change of job or place is in order, but you do not know how you can go about this transition. I want to talk in this lecture about breaking free, and I want to pass on 7 lessons for breaking free, and I do that today by means of a very important book for human history, which has influenced us here, especially in the West, which means a lot to me personally. And the book is called The Book About the Bear Who Wanted to Stay a Bear. It's a children's book. Some of you already know it because at the Eden Culture Conference I talked about it a lot. I actually found it again in the attic of my parents' house. That is, I had it as a kid and then I didn't look at it again for several decades. And when I found it again, I thought, wow, this is a children's book. It's about an incredibly deep topic of humanity. Now you probably want to hear the story. It's quite a simple story and touching and sweet. The bear, he looks up in the sky and notices that it's slowly getting colder and that the leaves are turning color and that he is also getting a little cold and tired. And following his instincts, he thinks, it's about time for a change of place. So the bear wanders into the forest until he reaches his old and trusty cave. Then he enters the cave and makes himself comfortable for hibernation, because in the next few months, not much will be happening. But a whole lot happens outside, because while the bear is sleeping, the forest is taken over by the humans. They measure it out and put down pipes and dig holes and even build something there. And while the bear is sleeping deep under the ground, the environment changes above him radically because they build a factory. Here you can see the bear as he sleeps in the ground, and above him there is suddenly a factory. As the bear wakes up at some point in spring, and as he yawns, stretches, and goes outside, he can't believe his eyes. He is immediately approached by some guard who says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And he replies, "I live here." "What, you live here? Get back to work at the assembly line." And the bear says, "What's an assembly line?" "Hey, you're just too lazy to work." "But I'm not a worker. I'm a bear." "What? A bear? I've never heard such a thing." So the worker takes the bear to his boss because he's being ridiculous. And the boss says, "What do I need to hear? I hear that you are a lazy worker." And the bear says, "I'm not really a worker, I'm a bear." And the boss says, "A bear? Well, that's amusing. Bears don't exist anymore. They're long extinct. The only thing we of course still have is the bears in an animal park or the bears at the circus. We could be maybe trying if you are one of them, or if you're just a bit stupid. Maybe you're just making stuff up that isn't real." So he packs up the bear and they drive to the zoo, and in the zoo bears live in cages and they are fed every day, and they ask the bear, "Who feeds you every day? In what cage do you live?" The bear doesn't understand the questions, and he says, "Nobody, I don't have a cage." Then the zoo bears say, "Then you are apparently not a bear." And then the boss says, "Didn't I tell you? But we can also drive to the circus." So they drive to the circus, and at the circus there are bears who do somersaults. Others can dance, and they ask the bear, "Can you do a somersault? Show us something. Can you at least juggle?" "What? You can't even dance? Then you can't be a bear." Meanwhile, the bear is at the end of his nerves and doesn't know anymore who he is. And then he says, "Okay, maybe the others are right." And just like everyone who does not know anymore who he is, he lets others do with him what they want him to do. And they first get him some proper clothes to wear. The bear gets an overall and even is shaved because he has to do that as a real worker. And here you see the bear at his first day of work as he stamps in his time card. And from now on, the bear gets in line like the others who work at the factory every day. And the following page that I'm going to show you, I didn't see it for decades, but when I saw it again, it hit me in the heart. This is the workplace of the bear. It's a big factory. He has no idea what is being made, some kind of screws or so. The only thing that he is told is, every time the red light turns on, you should press this button here. And so he becomes part of the machinery, and months go by. Day in, day out, he does the same thing. And the only thing he eventually notices is he gets so tired doing work hours. Sometimes he even falls asleep. He gets more and more tired and feels this inexplicable urge to at least go outside during the break in the factory courtyard. And there he stands at the barbed wire, and he watches the swallows fly south, and how it gets colder each day, and how the leaves turn color. And he's just always so tired. And because he's always tired and falls asleep at work more and more, just doesn't fit in, his colleagues one day kick him out. They say they don't need him anymore. But the bear doesn't know where else to go. The factory is all he still knows, and so he leaves with the few things he owns, and it starts to snow. He wanders deeper and deeper into the woods, it's snowing more, and finally he stops in front of the entrance of a cave. And this children's book, where we can ask ourselves if it even is a children's book, ends with the following words. He sat there and thought. He thought and thought. He had forgotten something important, but he just couldn't remember what he had forgotten. Quite sad. And we could ask ourselves, is this a children's story? Because aren't we adults often too stuck in such situations? Maybe you have forgotten where you came from. Maybe you forgot what you really wanted. The only thing you feel is the strange sense that something is not right. I want to tell you today, this feeling might be part of the solution. This feeling might be the best part of you. Give it room. A much older story about breaking free and coming home is more famous. It's so famous that the religion which mainly identifies with it, the Jews, celebrate a holiday every year called Passover, where on the first evening of the feast, they are to celebrate as if they themselves had left Egypt. Because breaking free is a human topic for entire cultures, but also for your own heart.
Ist ein Menschheitsthema, und zwar für ganze Kulturen, aber auch für dein eigenes Herz. Und ich möchte dir anhand
And I want to offer you with these 7 lessons kind of like a map for your own heart, where you can ask yourself, where am I actually right now in my journey to break free from slavery, with my arrival in the Promised Land? Where am I? The cave, freedom, or at least at home. 7 lessons for breaking free. And we are going to shamelessly compare, against all proper rules of exegesis, the story of the bear with the story of the book of Exodus. And that works better than you think. The bear already has a first lesson to overcome, and that is, he is oddly enough the only one who doesn't feel comfortable in his factory. You should think, sorry, who would ever want to work there? That's terrible and so boring. But the sad truth is, it's normal that most people consider captivity the norm. And that, by the way, also goes for the people of Israel when they go out of Egypt. There are so many people, and they are all slaves, but only one, namely Moses, who says, this is not right, this shouldn't be. The sad lesson is, there will always be a large amount of people who simply say, oh well, that's how it is. It's just always been that way. Like, stop complaining, that's normal. Most people think it's normal. In all of human history, it's been that way. All the great things that were ever achieved, invented, founded, or done were done by outsiders, with few exceptions. They were often the freaks, the weird ones who didn't fit in. Those were the ones who impacted history in the end, for better or for worse. I want to give you a sobering but impressive example. This is a picture from Austria in the 30s. There were plenty of such photos of random people standing in front of their farms. And one man in this photo, the guy on the bike, is Franz Jägerstätter. He was raised much like everyone else in the village. He had a similar job, he even went to the same church, had the same life as everyone else. But when the army draft came in 1939, he said, "I can't do this with clear conscience. That's a train heading to hell, and I'm not ready to go along with it." Everyone advised against his decision, saying, "What's the big deal? That's normal. Don't risk anything." Most people found it normal, but he didn't. The first lesson when you want to break free is a bit hard. It is that you are often the only one who wants to break free, and the rest thinks slavery is normal. And a first skill, a first lesson to break free for you to learn is loneliness competence. Loneliness often is seen as a negative, but there is also a positive loneliness competence. That is, I am willing to do something even if I don't get praised for it. That's the first cost for breaking free. I found it interesting that already in the book of Exodus, the biblical book, where it's about escaping slavery, we see this topic. One of the laws, relatively shortly after the Ten Commandments, says, "You shall not follow the majority to do evil. And you shall not do what everyone else does when it is the wrong thing, not even in a court case where the majority decide something unjust." Because we humans tend to just want to be wanted and to be liked. We feel very uncomfortable to be the outsider. That's very human but also dangerous. Psychologically, it's related to the following topic. They did famous experiments decades ago already called the Asch conformity experiment. It was repeated many times over, which means it works worldwide, because that's how humans are, and I will describe it. You see this drawing here. On the one side is a line, and on the other side there are 3 lines. Now think for a second which one of the 3 lines on the right is the same length as the line on the left, A, B, or C? Is A, B, or C as long as the one on the left? Who thinks that A is as long as the first line? B? Who says C? Okay, 98% of you say it's C. The experiment goes like this. You enter a room with 5 other people, but they are all actors. And you're sure that C is correct, but the 5 others are actors, and they say one by one, of course B, obviously. Sure, it's B. In most cases, if you are in this experiment, you would also say, okay, I guess you're all right then. Maybe it's B. Maybe my eyes aren't seeing it right. But if you all say it, it must be true. That's how human psychology works. But it's a dangerous dynamic of human psychology. That means to be a free, independent person has to do with loneliness competence. Namely to say, okay, even when not everyone goes with me, I'll stand up for something that I consider right. I trust my own eyes. That's the first lesson. The second lesson doesn't unfold so straightforwardly. We will jump now to the book of Exodus with Moses, because Moses is very upset that his people are enslaved. And so he thinks, hey, this random Egyptian who is abusing my people, I kill him. You can maybe understand when you are a freedom fighter and standing up against slavery, but the story doesn't really continue that well. It actually turns into quite a disaster, so it doesn't work well at all. Because this way to try and bring about justice obviously doesn't work. The opposite is true. One of his own people tells on him. A second lesson must also be learned by the bear. The bear goes off, but he doesn't know where he's going. He may set off, but he has forgotten who he is. And I call this second lesson hasty attempts. It's normal and can even be part of a good plan to sometimes try things too quickly. Hasty attempts are attempts which are meant well, but come from your own strength. Moses had to get to the point where he realized, darn, I don't have it all figured out. Moses had to come to the point where he first had to have something changed in himself. Maybe you are in a situation where you think, why did this thing, which I tried so hard for good goals, not work? Maybe it was a hasty attempt. Luckily, the story doesn't end there. It's not the last chapter, but the next chapter gets difficult, at least for Moses. That is, Moses had to flee from Egypt, and he came to a place that didn't feel great, namely the desert. And he spends a long time in the desert. He has to watch sheep there, so it doesn't look like a best position for a world changer. I set out to change the world, and instead I'm hanging out in the desert for 40 years. Can you relate? Maybe you yourself are in a situation like that. Moses had to stay in the desert a very long time, and it almost looks like God has forgotten him, as if his plan was over. Who of you has ever been to a real desert? One of the first things you notice about a desert is how incredibly quiet it is there. There are hardly any sounds, and of course it's also very lonely. And maybe you are in a phase of life, or were in such a phase, where you had the feeling I could call but no echo comes back, like a desert. I could wait, but nobody will come. It's just quiet. Or maybe you are in such a time right now and are tempted to believe you just did something wrong. But that doesn't have to be the reason. That's not the reason for Moses. We read later an interesting statement about Moses, about how he is with his character. The first was that he was raised at Pharaoh's court and that he later killed someone. So you could think he's someone who thinks highly of himself and is quite impulsive, thinks he's the savior of the world. But several chapters later, we read this statement. Moses was the most humble of all people. Humility is kind of out of fashion these days. Humility doesn't mean to think badly of yourself. It means, I don't think too highly of myself. Humility is the willingness to learn, the will to listen. We don't know exactly what happened in those desert years with Moses, but the result was that he became humble. We live in a day where having virtue and being one of the good guys is relatively easy. You only need to post the right thing. And you put the right symbol on your status, whatever is right at the moment, in order to show that you are one of the good guys. You are offended by injustice, or you are an ally to the oppressed, and that really makes you good. Or you join some sort of outward movement, And that can all be good, but the risk is that we confuse this for virtue, for true virtue. Because true virtue has to prevail and it grows in the secret. It had more to do with who you are instead of what you post or say or look on the outside. And for that reason, the stillness, the time in the desert is so important. It is even a principle throughout the Bible that all great heroes, all great figures had such times. Joseph was in prison for a time. Jesus went to the desert for a time before his ministry. And clearly, something happens there. And it even repeats itself afterwards with all the people, just as Moses went through it himself already. That's an important principle. Before you can deliver the people from slavery and lead them into freedom, you have to first walk that path yourself. Moses had to stay himself in the desert before something happened. Later, it's the same for the people. And here again, God didn't plan for them a punishment like, I'll just let you be stuck here in the desert. You could ask, why 40 years anyway? Seems so long. Instead, God says, I'll drive the enemies out, but not right away. Instead, he says, I will drive them out before you bit by bit until you have become strong enough on your own to take over the land. Do you understand the teaching principle behind it? The logic isn't you are forgotten in the desert. Instead, a place and victory becomes available to you in the same level that you have grown and matured into. And that takes time. The good news is the story doesn't end there either. This isn't the last lesson, but it's unfortunately also a lesson. One we don't like to hear, the lesson of the desert. And maybe you are currently in this lesson of the desert. The main temptation here is to despair and think, I've done something wrong, it's my fault. But maybe you're just in a time of preparation. And the wonderful thing with Moses is that in this time of preparation, where seemingly nothing is going on, the most powerful thing happens, at the most unseeming place ever. Namely, somewhere on Mount Sinai, far away from great civilization. Just a random place, not even a great building, just at a bush of thorns, that's where Moses meets something extraordinary. So thorns in the Bible have a double-edged connotation to begin with, because thorns came after the story of the Garden of Eden, after sin entered the world. Like they are a sign that the earth is contaminated with evil. And in the middle of this sinful world, on this average, day-to-day desert mountain, God meets Moses. You know the story where the thorn bush is burning but not burning up, and Moses gets closer and looks at it and says, why is the bush burning and not burning up? And then from the thorn bush, the voice of God speaks and introduces himself as the great I Am. The God who has seen the misery of his people and who does not look away from slavery. He calls to Moses from the thorn bush, and Moses' reply is really interesting. He answers with the word Hineni. It means, here I am. Moses says, here I am, and God basically tells him the same. Yes, I am also here. I am the God who is here. I am the I Am. The fourth and wonderful lesson is, you won't just find emptiness in the desert, but God waits there to meet you. The Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung said once, as he looked back at his work as a therapist, he could not remember a case where a patient was healed from a deep psychological problem without first encountering the transcendent. There is nothing else that changes people as deeply as when they meet God. And such people then carry a different authority. With Moses, we later read that he comes down from the mountain and his face glows. He himself doesn't notice, but the people around him do. Erich Fromm wrote in a book that there are different kinds of authority that people have. There is, for example, the authority, I'm the teacher, that's just my position. Or I am the boss, so you just do what I say. That is an authority based on position. Or there is an authority through money, which says, if I want to, I'll buy out the store. But then Erich Fromm says there is also a being authority. Being authority is an authority, a weight that a person carries not because of what they own or what they have, but because of who they are. And that is the kind of authority you can get when you encounter God. And I find it really remarkable. Just a quick comment about that "Here I am" from Moses. So from the burning bush, God calls Moses, and he then responds, "Here I am." In our translations, we might skip over this phrase too quickly. Of course, here I am. Where else would he be? But this phrase appears in the Bible at three significant places. In the Garden of Eden, man hides and God searches for them. It's not like this that we are looking for God and He's so far away. Biblically, it's the other way around. We are far away and we have gotten lost and God comes looking for us. And the first person who says, "Here I am," is Abraham. God speaks to Abraham in Genesis 17 and Abraham answers, "Here I am." And the next passage in the book of Isaiah, the prophet stands in a heavenly throne room and a question is asked, "Hey, whom shall we send? Who would go to the earth and bring the word of God?" And then the prophet answers, "Hineni, here I am, send me." And the second of three appearances, we have it here with Moses. Moses says, "Here I am." Saying this "here I am" is something very deep. Adorno has said for some people it's already brazen when they even have the word "I" in their mouth. Because it isn't by any means trivial. What do you even mean, I? How deep does that go? When we say, "I am just who I am," okay, what does that mean? Who is actually speaking? I read you a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, namely Martin Buber. Martin Buber says, "Whatever someone say after I," so after what they mean when they say I, determines where a person belongs and where his journey will lead. It can move them to horror when it comes from a chaotic, contradictory, wild and careless mouth. When it comes from a vain and simplifying place, it's embarrassing or disgusting. He says, but how great and just sounds the lively, the insistent I of Socrates, or the I that Goethe speaks. Or he writes, the I that Jesus says, who is only the Son of the Father. We believe these days very strongly that who you are is more something deep inside of you rather than something you do. I am not defined by what I do, but more by who I am. And that's partially true, that you are not just defined by what you do, but Moses only truly finds his identity when he lets God send him to his calling. You find out who you really are when you put yourself in service of something greater. Not by looking deep inside yourself and thinking and taking a personality test or whatever. Who you really are will develop when you do what is right, when you do what is your calling. Here I am, replies Moses at this self-revelation of God who says, I am the I am.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
Now we could think, okay, so we have the encounter in the desert and the calling. Now we can finally step into freedom. Only, unfortunately, there is someone who doesn't like that idea, to see the people walk into freedom. And that someone is the boss of the whole slavery thing, also called Pharaoh. If you ever were in a museum for Egyptian art, you can only be amazed with what kind of power the pharaohs were equipped. What an incredible amount of courage it took to face this pharaoh. But actually, the next lesson for someone to break free is urgently necessary. It is absolutely important to confront the Pharaoh, the confrontation with the thing that blocks the way to freedom. Because clearly there is something blocking the way to freedom. Here you can see a Pharaoh. He would have like a snake mask. Kind of stern, right? I admit they had refined taste, but here confrontation is inevitable. And besides, confrontation is better than its reputation. Especially if you are a person who finds it important to be loving and be empathetic, then you might tend to underestimate how important the opposite can be sometimes. Who never loses their mind about some things, they have no mind to lose. It is already written in Emilia Galotti by Lessing. There are things you just can't call okay and tolerate. Some things need to be confronted. That's true just with psychology. Many people have a limited access to their anger because they only see anger as negative. Don't be upset, be nice. You of course learn that from your home that you always have to behave. But that brings negative feelings into your life, like fear, shame, and disgust. You take those in, but they simmer. Your anger is actually the energy that doesn't keep you stuck in fear, but it says, and I'm going to change something. Anger is the energy that says, I will not be ashamed anymore, I won't run away anymore. Because if you are too nice, you are kind to everything, but not kind to yourself anymore. When you are too nice, you think high of others, but you lose respect for yourself. So disgust and shame enter your life. In the end, you are disgusted of yourself. That is a purely psychological observation, but this ability to confront is very important. And then there's people who think they can just think their way out of everything. Everything is just a thought. They go read another book. To break free has to do with action. Only in what you do, only as you confront Pharaoh for real, freedom will come. Seems to be the case anyway that God prefers those who also do something, because the others only talk, they only complain about slavery. Sure, Moses also makes a lot of mistakes, like killing that Egyptian, but clearly God says, at least you are doing something, I can work with you. So don't get stuck being passive. Next to last lesson. Now the confrontation with the Pharaoh is past. You could think, now things will be looking up. In reality, something strange happens. On the one hand, the people of Israel experience God's wonders, the parting of the sea. On the other hand, they experience this. Suddenly, we are out of water. We are hungry and there are enemies. But then there's miracles again. So some things happen and others don't. And this lesson I will call the not yet. In the lessons of already but not yet, you could also say that we can see some things of the new already but others not. That's true, even just psychologically. For example, when you break out of a toxic relationship, an addiction, a bad job, a broken family, move to a new city, then you also have this tension. It's not so easy to handle. Some things are already better, but not everything is better. And that goes for the spiritual dimension too. In all those years where the Israelites wander in the desert, there was a constant tendency. Is God really good? Was it really a good idea to leave Egypt? Or wouldn't it be better to just go back there to Egypt? It wasn't that terrible. They had some great architecture, the Sphinx and stuff. And it was only great in their minds because life in Egypt was not great at all. But when you are down and discouraged, your mind plays the strangest tricks. And in this phase, it's very important that you don't believe everything that you think, and that you don't believe your desires too much. It could be that you long for something, like for a fixed idea. If I had that, then everything would be better. But maybe that's not true. I'll give you an example. I read it in a book from a coach recently. He said he had coached a family, a married couple who had come in the 1950s as migrant workers from Italy to Germany. And in Germany, it was already a bit too cold. They were there because of the job, but always thought of their Italian tomatoes and of the lemons of the Amalfi Coast and how nice everyone was. And they thought of their village where everything was great. Then they moved to Düsseldorf. And their whole life they longed for Italy. And they basically survived off of this desire to go back to Italy. And eventually, they were finally 65, they sold everything in Germany and moved back to Italy, and they realized that everything was different. The people they used to know were either dead or had moved. The place where they used to play was a giant furniture store now. The food didn't taste as good as they remembered either. They realized that it was all their memories and it wasn't real. Your desires can trick you to believe something that isn't real. Don't trust that voice that says, "No, go back." In Egypt, it was at least safe, and you knew the place. Go forward, even if the path is sometimes difficult. Don't go back because of comfort. In the end, the question in this already but not yet is God really good? Can I really trust Him? Or did He just want to trick me? What is the seventh and last lesson to break free? You could say now, okay, now we just get there. In the story of the Exodus from Egypt by the Israelites, it amazingly enough happens differently. And do you know how? The generation that left Egypt never lives to reach the promised land. They die before that, with exception of a few people. But the new generation moves in. And actually, the great vision already becomes reality, but in a way that it only is fulfilled over the course of several generations. And it could be that you experience certain victories in your life, understand certain things, celebrate certain wins, but maybe not everything. It could be that other things that you built up will die, or that they stay only a partial success. But it could be that some things just are meant for the next generation. Today, this way of thinking is unfamiliar to us because we think from one year to the next. In politics, too, we think from one legislation period to the next. I wonder sometimes what would the decisions of our society look like if we were to think what general conditions, what we are creating right now, are suited so the next generation can move forward. In the ecological area, we are advancing by the word sustainability, but in other areas not so much. Which life choices may you not be making for yourself at all, but for the next generation? And if you say, I don't have any kids, it doesn't matter, you still influence people who are born after you. That's actually quite a beautiful and relaxing view of things, that some things may not turn into paradise in my lifetime, but I can hand over the things I helped build, and other people can work to finish them. And I believe that it is a compass of wisdom to ask yourself which values and choices are sustainable so that the next generation can live in them. We now leave the book of Exodus and come back to the bear. The bear who wanted to stay a bear. He had a problem. He had forgotten that he was a bear. And as I said before, when you forget who you are, then it can happen that you put on things that don't suit you at all. That you let people push you into circumstances which are not good for you. I believe that we as a humanity are also in danger to forget who we are as humans. That we don't quite remember what makes us human. What is human life like? Are humans even good? And what is their characteristics? What makes us different from monkeys or so? One guy who teaches us in that is, for example, Yuval Harari, a history professor from Israel, whose writing I've already contended with at the Eden Culture Conference a little. He says we are basically just another kind of monkey. We just have a faster brain. And that was an evolutionary advantage. But when computers come around that are faster than human brains, they will overtake us. And when that's the perspective on humans, then it's purely technical, controlled, a pre-planned computer world of logic. But I honestly don't think that this would be a world where humans feel at home anymore. And that's why I think we should be people who foster more of this point of view and who encourage others to do it. Because our story from a Christian perspective continues in such an amazingly good way. If a bear from the forest had come to the bear in the factory and had reminded them and said, "Come home, what have you gotten yourself into?" then he would have had a real chance. The good news is that we believe that. We Christians believe that it wasn't only Moses who led the people out of Israel to freedom, but that there is someone who, as the only person ever has lived that freedom, who came back to the rigid, slave-like factory of humanity in order to say, "Hey, return, come out of that false reality. You aren't made for that. You feel that it isn't right." And the bear who calls us back is Jesus. And the question is he right or is he wrong? That is answered with the question, is there a cave or not? But you can't understand the bear as a bear if you don't know the cave. And the more our society forgets God, the more it forgets its humanity. The more our society loses sight of God, the more we build ourselves a world that no longer bears the image of humanity. Because we forgot how to be human, how being a human works. What incredibly good news that there really is this Jesus who calls you out to a way of breaking free, who won't leave you hanging. Also good news, it's not a cheap solution. Believe in something, sign here, and it's all perfect. It won't all be perfect. It's a journey, and on that journey there are ups and downs, just like with the Israelites in the desert. And then they grumble again, and then there's tragedy and war, and like in real life. But Moses keeps going with them. And that's the key point in your life too. There are ups and downs, real ones. But the bear who calls you back to the cave, he carries on with you. He is Jesus. And he stays with you, and he won't leave you hanging. And yes, the cave is real. Home is real. You can dare to break free through all 7 lessons. Because you can really get there. There really is a home.